Arena, Daggerfall, Morrowind, Oblivion, Skyrim. The games of the Elder Scrolls series are loved by many. They are games of great scope, of gods and mortals, but they are also personal and carry great thematic meaning to the player. Today on Origin of the Series, we're going to go through the history of the Elder Scrolls, from before the founding of Bethesda to Skyrim and beyond. As always, I have a few guests joining me to speak about the impact the series has had on them. Welcome to Origin of the Series, The Elder Scrolls. Christopher Weaver wore many hats before founding Bethesda. He was what he considered to be a technology forecaster for the TV and cable industry. In that role, Weaver held positions with ABC, the National Cable Television Association, and even Congress, working for the House Subcommittee on Communications. It was there that he did minor things, like help break up the telephone monopoly. When he moved back into the private sector, he created his own media consulting firm called Media Technology. One of Weaver's employees, an engineer by the name of Ed Fletcher, had the idea that media technology should expand into video games. Specifically, he wanted to create a football video game, something that Weaver wasn't terribly familiar with. However, Weaver was an expert on something extremely critical to the understanding of sports gaming: physics. The result was the first football video game to use real physics, called Gridiron, and Bethesda Softworks was born. The name comes directly from the town the company was founded in, Bethesda, Maryland. In the early days, the principals were Weaver, Fletcher, and a Danish programmer named Benny Jensen, but Elder Scrolls fans know him better as Julian Lafay. Electronic Arts was interested in the way Gridiron worked and contracted Bethesda to develop the first John Madden football. Bethesda would not end up completing the programming, but the underlying physics engine belonged to the work that Weaver and Fletcher created for Gridiron. The young company left EA to the football simulations and shifted focus to ice hockey. They worked with the hockey community and legends like Bobby Orr to create their next series of games, which featured Wayne Gretzky on the cover. Eventually, Weaver and Bethesda began to work on their first non-sports game, which was a movie-to-game adaptation of The Terminator. Weaver says that the focus on sports wasn't intentional, but because of the real-time physics tools they had created, they were looking for as many areas to apply them as they could.
My first experience with the Elder Scrolls came with Daggerfall, the second one in the series. I never played Arena, but Daggerfall came out, and it was, I got it at first as a demo on, I think it was PC Gamer. It was one of the computer gaming magazines, obviously. Because you see, kids, back in the day, games had demos. They were little mini snippets of the game that you could play before you played the full thing. It's kind of a thing that's going away.
The first time I experienced the Elder Scrolls, I was no more than 10 or 11, and I purchased Morrowind Game of the Year edition for the original Xbox.
It was the first summer after the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion had just been out for a few months. I went to a local GameStop near me to look at some new games and expressed to one of the guys working there out of frustration that I was just getting bored of the games that I was playing too easily and finishing them too quickly.
We played that demo forever because you could. Because of how big that game was, that even the demo provided hours and hours and hours of dungeon crawling and developing characters. And back in those days, with the earlier ones, you could pick a class or you could create a class of your own.
I think I was a little bit too young still to really, wrap my head around everything the game had to offer, so I mostly explored and spoke with people and kind of, just immersed myself in the world.
And I got the game, I popped in a disc as soon as I got home, I created my character, worked my way out of the Imperial prison, through the first dungeon, to step foot outside and see the world of Tamriel for the first time. And it was right then and there where I realized that what I was about to experience was going to be another world that was so massive, so alive and immersive that it would just completely revolutionize how I think about video games forever. And that's exactly what happened.
But I remember how enthralling that was, and I had never really experienced a game world that felt so open and well realized, and I think that was probably the most special element and what's always kept me coming back.
And then we get into the full version and we're finding just all kinds of exotic weapons and armor and that kind of thing. And it was bananas. It was so much fun. So Daggerfall was my first Elder Scrolls game, and in many ways it's the one I have the fondest memories of, because that kind of childhood nostalgia, you really can't shake that off.
Jack Chick, the infamous author of the heavy-handed fundamentalist Christian comic strips known as Chick Tracts, died in 2016. He believed that Dungeons & Dragons and role-playing was the path to hell and damnation. Thankfully, the developers working at Bethesda Softworks were unfazed by the father of the Satanic Panic's proclamations of fire and brimstone. Because in the early 90s, staff at Bethesda held weekly Dungeons & Dragons games, which they had set in a world very familiar to Elder Scrolls players. Tamriel Arena is the first entry in the Elder Scrolls series. As a game, it doesn't have the grand scope of Daggerfall, or the growing 3D polish that entries Morrowind and beyond would receive, but it was one of the earlier first-person RPGs to have that kind of scale. However, the game didn't begin its life as an RPG. Initially, the game was true to its title, functioning as a medieval-style gladiator combat simulator. As the player, you built a team of fighters and took them from city to city, tournament to tournament, until you reached the grand stage of them all, fighting in the Imperial City. The designers of the game were Ted Peterson and Vijay Lakshman, with the project being spearheaded by Julian LeFay. According to Ted, the story was that there was an evil wizard that you needed to fight at the end of the game when you reached the Imperial City. Gradually, they began adding side quests that you could do in each town. Then came the dungeons. Eventually, the idea of there being a tournament vanished from the story, as the role-playing, side quests, and dungeon diving became the primary focus. The game had evolved from a first-person fighting game to a hardcore D&D-inspired RPG over the course of development, but the name Arena remained. Why? The story and the lore is that the land of Tamriel was so violent it was nicknamed the Arena. However, the real reason was that they had already printed up a bunch of boxes and materials with the name Arena on it, and it was too costly to change the name. Vijay is credited with giving it the series title The Elder Scrolls, mainly because it was vague enough that they could work with it without having to develop much more story. The story of the finished game went like this. Uriel Septim's battle mage, Yagar Tharn, used the Staff of Chaos to imprison Uriel in an alternate dimension and take the Septim's place on the throne in disguise. Your player works for the Emperor, ostensibly this is not made crystal, alongside a character named Rhea. The two of you attempt to expose Yagar but are thwarted. Yagar kills Rhea and imprisons your player character in the dungeon. Rhea's ghost helps you get free and you must begin your quest to piece together the now shattered Chaos Staff and rescue Uriel Septim. The game featured a character creation system, which allowed you to select your character's gender, class, and home province. The map in the game features all the provinces we've come to know and love, such as Skyrim, Morrowind, Hammerfell, and so forth. While the size of the map is smaller than latter iterations, especially Daggerfall, the scope of the game is immense given the game's historical context. The release of Arena begins a thread of tenuous existence for the franchise that doesn't truly develop into a sturdy rope until Morrowind. The game missed its holiday of 1993 release window and ended up coming out in March 1994, which was considered to be one of the worst times of the year to release at that time. Additionally, distributors were not thrilled that the game did not resemble the original Gladiator action game pitch. Thankfully for Elder Scrolls fans everywhere, the game spread by word of mouth and became, in Ted Peterson's words, a minor cult hit. The next year, Bethesda would re-release the game on CD-ROM as The Elder Scrolls Arena Deluxe, and testing that would be Todd Howard's introduction to the Elder Scrolls world. Todd Howard has been firmly rooted in geek culture his entire life. As a kid, he loved Star Wars and gaming, specifically spending a lot of time in games like Ultima, which would eventually have an influence on the Elder Scrolls series. While Howard was in college at William & Mary, he spent much of his time teaching himself programming and playing video games, when he wasn't in classes earning a finance degree. Todd actually mentions that William & Mary is a terrific school and that he, unfortunately, did not take advantage of that fact. While playing one of Bethesda's Wayne Gretzky hockey games, Todd noticed the address for their office was on the way home from college, so during Christmas break he boldly stopped at the headquarters and asked for a job. Though rejected, Todd continued to pester Bethesda for work each time he encountered representatives for the company, including at expos like CES. Eventually, his perseverance paid off, and Bethesda hired him in 1994. Todd's first games as a designer were in the Terminator franchise that Bethesda had been producing since before Arena, and then he was pulled in to assist on Daggerfall as a new designer.
I think I remember one of our favorite things to do, my brother and I, when we were playing Daggerfall, was we would play. I always play thieves. I always play thieves in fantasy games. It's my favorite. I like picking pockets and picking locks and sneaking around, stealth, that kind of thing. To this day, it's how I always play Elder Scrolls games.
One of my most memorable Elder Scrolls moments was in Morrowind, and I was still a kid at playing the original Xbox version. And I was wandering around the Ascadian Isles, which is like a kind of foresty region right next to Balmora. I really didn't know what I was doing. I was still exploring in like the early stages of the game. And I was just beat the hell up. I had run into a bunch of hostile wildlife, so I was like almost dead. And I tried to rest, and at this point it was raining and really dark and spooky.
Because the game is known to have some pretty funny glitches that you can encounter, and after seeing some of them for myself, I decided to search online for more, and I found a plethora of 2006 Oblivion glitch videos, which I just had a blast watching to see all the different ways that you can exploit the gameplay while trying some of them out for myself.
One of the spells was open, and it was meant to open locks. So what we would do is we would hang around town and just wait until it got dark and the stores closed, because in this they locked the doors behind them, and we would either pick the lock, and if we couldn't do that, if we weren't up to snuff on that, we would cast open on the lock.
I tried to rest for a moment, and as many of you Morrowind players will know, the add-on content, I think it's Blood Moon, has a Dark Brotherhood assassin try to assassinate you sometimes when you sleep. So I was awoken by this assassin trying to kill me, and I just remember sprinting through the rain and the mud through this dark forested area just with this assassin on my tail, just freaking the hell out. And I remember seeing, I think it was Caldera on like the horizon, and just like sprinting full speed over there so that the guards would help me with the assassin.
And I will never, ever forget the famous duplication glitch and the wrath that occurred when you abused it to do things like spawn a sea of thousands of watermelons inside of people's homes, inside of shops, in churches, and pretty much anywhere that you wanted.
We would take everything out of the store, and you couldn't, and we had to go to a next town. We have to go to a next town to sell that stuff off, because you couldn't sell it back to the guy because they'd get pissed off at you. It was like the thieves trader route. You know, you would start in one town, rob everybody blind, go to a next town, sell all that stuff to them, and then rob them blind, and then go to the next town. And it was just this Ouroboros of stealing and selling and stealing and selling, to the point that every town we went to, we were wanted as criminals because we weren't that good at covering it up. And so we would have to go dungeon crawling in an effort to hope that things would die down. But of course, it's not going to die down until you pay them off or get killed. So that was something we loved to do.
It felt very immersive in that I felt like that was what I would have actually done had I been placed in the same situation.
With Arena out the door and achieving minor cult hit status, attention turned to the inevitable sequel, Daggerfall. Over the course of 2 years, Ted Peterson and Julian Lefay wrote the story while consuming many influences. Ted's stated goal was to make the world of Tamriel less generic. New influences included additional bits of Dungeons & Dragons, but also the pen and paper version of Vampire: The Masquerade, as well as the Alexander Dumas classic, The Man in the Iron Mask. Whereas Arena had been influenced heavily by other games, such as Darklands, Legends of Valor, and Ultima Underworld, Daggerfall was influenced more by the pen and paper and literary sources. Daggerfall was ambitious. The game had large portions of procedurally generated landscape and came out to be approximately 62,000 square miles. Arena's map technically didn't have any boundaries, therefore was undefinable, and travel between provinces was only available on the fast travel map. Daggerfall, though, was designed to be one continuous map over parts of High Rock and Hammerfell. For years, it held the record as the largest game until No Man's Sky procedurally generated it right into second place. All that ambition came at a price, however. Daggerfall had numerous bugs at launch, and many of the features that the designers wanted in the game were never fully implemented. Ted Peterson mentions that the intent was to have warring factions that actually have real-world consequences, like seeing cities under siege. The sieges, as well as dragons, were left on the cutting room floor of the game because of technical and time limitations. Reading preview articles from old gaming magazines is an enjoyable pastime for me. Something about the optimism married with boundless speculation is charming, especially when you know the outcome. One found in Next Generation magazine proclaimed that if Daggerfall were able to put all the pieces that they had in motion into place for the release of the game, then Daggerfall would be the best role-playing game ever made. While I don't believe Daggerfall is in that consideration, it is truly a remarkable experience. By the game's release in 1996, however, there was some pushback from the gaming press. Computer Gaming World put Daggerfall as one of the top vaporware titles of all time. Strange that being delayed a few years in the mid-90s was enough to earn the title of vaporware, whereas presently game delays are met with groans, but not enough to deem a game vaporware. See The Last Guardian and No Man's Sky as examples. Despite the success of the game, the goodwill earned by Arena was dissipated by the bug-ridden Daggerfall. Things would get worse before they got better for Bethesda. Sales took a bit of a decline for Bethesda after Daggerfall. Daggerfall's follow-ups were not met with the same enthusiasm or sales that Daggerfall initially had garnered. Follow-up games that used Daggerfall's code included Battlespire and RedGaurd. Battlespire was the first, and was considerably pared down compared to Daggerfall. A lot of the free-roaming exploration that made Daggerfall the game that it was tossed aside for a focus on combat and very specifically designed dungeons. Battlespire wasn't met with particular enthusiasm. Like the game it was based on, it launched with bugs and was found to be a tepid entry into the Elder Scrolls gaming catalog. It sold poorly, as did the next game, RedGaurd. RedGaurd was played entirely from the third-person point of view, which until that point was not available in the Elder Scrolls games. Bethesda was nearly bankrupt, so Chris Weaver made a bold move and founded a new company with Robert Altman named ZeniMax Media, and then moved Bethesda into it from its original shell of media technology. The move saved Bethesda's existence from an untimely end, but at the expense of Chris Weaver's position in the company. He moved from CEO to CTO in favor of Altman, but within a few years, he would find himself out of the company that he founded. Thanks for tuning into part 1 of Origin of the Series, The Elder Scrolls. In part 2, we will continue on the journey through the history of the Elder Scrolls series, starting with Morrowind. Thanks to my panelists, Belmont Boy, Andy Jackal, and Phil the Conquistador. If you notice any inaccuracies, please leave a note in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this content, please leave a like, comment, and consider subscribing with notifications. Thanks again for watching. Until next time.